Well, hello folks, and welcome to episode 187, Retro Power and Cut. And the sun's out, it's a beautiful day outside, we're not going to have doors closed, it's not raining, brilliant. Finally some good weather's arrived. Anyway, we're going to start with the Interceptor. Stu has been chiefly working on exhaust system related things. Just been finishing off a couple of bits to do with the pipe work on that, and then moved on to the heat shielding. So he got the pipework all to the fully tacked up stage, all throughout, everything tacked in place but not fully welded, and then we'll come on to fully welding that up in a minute. He then moved on to the various areas that we wanted to heat shield from other components on the car, and I think some of our viewers had picked up on the fuel tank area, and we plan to put a heat shield in there. We got the material. It's I'm going to have a brain fade now on who makes it, but it's a double layer aluminium crinkle type of material. Jamie will have plenty of footage of it. It's made by Federal Mogul. It's a Federal Mogul product, and Stu's has made a few test samples up to work out how best to edge that material, because there are various ways we can finish the edges on it. It needs to be reasonably tough, it needs to not vibrate and rattle and make noises, and it needs to maintain its shape once we've made those, once we've made the pieces. So Stu has come up with a couple of ways of doing that. One was to fold the edges, basically put a crease line in with the bead roller around, and then put a fold in, and then a second fold in, and that hems the edge quite nicely. Another way was to make a folded piece of aluminium, a 1.2mm aluminium sheet, folded and then swaged around the edge, and then nipped in place with basically dot punch marks to hold it in place. Either will work, and he's actually used both. On where he can, he's done the double hem, because that adds quite a nice reinforcement to the edge of the parts, and where he couldn't do the double hem, he, as on this piece here as an example, he's put a folded piece of aluminium around the edges. As you can see on this piece, this is one of the flat sections, so he's folded some aluminium around that and then nipped that into place. We've actually got to put, he was just talking to me just before we started filming this, we've got to put some little aluminium bits of TIG weld just to tack those corners together to hold them together. If I run over here, there's an example of one of the other shields with the edges done with the double hem, which works quite nicely as well. And he's put these swaged in sections to hold the bolts to locate those. So we're getting to a position of having the heat shielding pretty much all complete. He's then moved on to looking at the front suspension, because a job we've been putting off, well actually mainly because of waiting for parts, was the upper front wishbones. We were awaiting some parts from Heights to convert those to a bushed adjuster from a solid rose joint. And those adjusters have turned up, but it's confirmed the fact that we do need to remake the upper wishbones. They're not wide enough to accommodate those adjusters, so we've got to remake the upper wishbones, which isn't too horrendous a job. The only downside and complication is that the outer thread on the in-situ adjusters that Heights have used is a 1-inch 14 TPI thread, which is a little bit frustrating. It's left-hand as well, so it's a 1-inch 14 TPI left-hand, which isn't really a thing. 1-inch UNF is 12 TPI, so it's actually slightly finer than UNF. It's not really an available thread, and it certainly isn't available as a tap in a left hand at that pitch. I don't think it's available in that pitch at all as a tap, so they'll need to be thread cut. I personally don't fancy internal threading that size. I don't have a boring bar to do it, and by the time I've bought the boring bar and the threading insert to do that, it'll be cheaper for me to get somebody else to do it. So I'm going to be farming out the job of threading the ends of the tubes with which to make the upper wishbones. I've just ordered the material, which will be 1.25 OD, 3/16 of an inch wall, cold drawn tube, which we have to put a bend in and then cut off part way on the bend to fabricate the upper wishbones. More will become clear on that in future weeks, but I've ordered that, and also we need to make some long pins for the upper wishbone pivots, which were just bolts. However, getting bolts in the right grade of the right length is not going to be particularly easy, and they're going to be jolly expensive if I do. And to be fair, I probably won't be able to be very picky on the grade of bolts. So what we'll do there is just use some EN24T 5/8 inch EN24T bright bar. We'll thread the ends 5/8 UNF, and then we'll fit stover nuts to that, and on one of them we will put high strength Loctite on that. It basically then makes it become a bolt head. So one end the nut will just not move on the thread, the other end it will. That's fine. We just mark up which end is the moving end, which end isn't. I've done the same before. The Escort suspension uses a similar setup. We just high strength Loctite the nut on one end of it, and don't Loctite the nut on the, just use a self-locking nut on the other end, and the high strength Loctite will always beat the self-locking nut, and therefore effectively you make it into a bolt. Works very successful solution where you need an odd size. EN24T is fairly easy to thread cut, but still, you know, it's usually somewhere in the region of 850 newtons a square mil tensile, so easily an equivalent to an 8.8 grade bolt, so more than strong enough for the job it's got to do. So that's what we're going to do on that. And I think that pretty much is where we're at on Interceptor. Things are moving ahead nicely. What I'll come back to actually is that on the same car but different person, Tom has picked up the final welding on the exhaust system. So there's been a slight lull for various reasons, which we'll come on to in a minute. So Tom was able to pick that up. It was a job I was going to do, but that's great because it's alleviated me from having to do that job to let me do some other things. So Tom's done a lovely job of all the final welds on that. It's all back purged. We use the back purge setup on the welder. We've got a second flow meter on there. Again, this is teaching people to suck eggs, I imagine, that watch this channel. If you want more detail on anything like this, put it in the comments and I'll pick it up in a future episode. But basically, the backside of welds on stainless steel tube really do need to be purged. You can do it without. It's not optimal though. You'll get crystallization, oxidization on the back of the welds, which obscures the flow a little bit in the pipe, impedes the flow in the pipe a bit, and it can be a source of cracking. It won't normally, in real world, on an exhaust system, under normal stresses on a non-turbocharged engine, it generally won't cause cracking, but it's better to back purge it. It's just generally better, and it also welds much more easily. If you back purge it, the weld on the front side of the pipe, if you like, on the outside actually goes much smoother anyway. So we seal the ends of the pipe up with foil HVAC tape. You can use bungs. They're an advantage in that they're much quicker over most of the pipe. The downside is they can't generally withstand the heat very easily on the ends of the pipe, on the welds near the ends. So you need an alternative on the ends. You generally need to use HVAC tape, which is very heat resistant on the end welds anyway. So at that point you might as well just use the same HVAC tape to seal the ends of the pipe for the whole job. So yeah, foil tape, HVAC tape up the ends of the pipe. Pop a hole in one end, stick your purge pipe in that, pop a few little pepper pot of holes in the other end to let the gas come out, crank the purge flow meter open, let the argon fill the pipe and push all the air out. Once that's happened, turn the flow meter down and just keep a little tick overflow, couple of litres a minute going, just to keep it clear, and then do your welds on the outside. We've got a big Furic Pyrex cup, which gives really nice gas coverage, keeps the welds looking nice and clean. And yeah, Tom's done a lovely job of that lot. Got all that finished welded, and Stu's kind of putting it back together on the car now with trying to work the heat shields out for the final time, get everything final assembled. Obviously it's all going to come off again yet, but finally assembling it, just make sure everything still goes together, because there will be an element of pulling with all the welds. Generally it's better to try and do one full weld at a time, but that is an incredibly time consuming way of doing it because the system has to come on and off for every weld. So actually what we do is tack everything as best we can, fully weld it, and then if there are any tweaks needed, there may be the odd adjustment needed at the end, but hopefully not. Otherwise the time-consuming way is just unbelievably, it would probably add 3 days, I would say, to the job of doing the system, taking it on and off for every weld. So it's just, you know, the expense goes up hugely. So that's where we're at on the Interceptor. Then we're going to move on to a two-pronged attack actually, onto blasting. So I'm going to run over here. I'm going to run backwards and forwards a bit actually on this, because On Tuesday, we blasted and zinc metal sprayed and epoxy primed this, the second Allegro, which is actually the first Allegro, because everybody becoming an in-joke by now, I imagine. But that was blasted and zinc metal sprayed and epoxy primed on Tuesday as a sort of a team effort. Mark blasted it, I zinc metal sprayed it, Mark cleaned it up and epoxied it, and I cleared up the blast room, ready for the next blasting job. So that's all looking good. That's now back out. The epoxy's all cured. Today, this is Thursday morning actually now, and it's a short week. We started on Tuesday, bank holiday was Monday. So yeah, this has gone pretty well. Was all cured, ready to go yesterday. Bobby and Tom and Matt have got it back on the jig and are doing the final panel alignments, ready to bond all the carbon panels onto that now. And then hopefully at some point next week, I would say that'll be also ready to go into the body shop. More on that in a bit. So that's where we're at on a brief synopsis of where we're at on the Allegro. We'll keep that all reasonably brief because there's been other blasting work going on, which is that the Project Portofino Jaguar XJ Coupe is now into the mix. As you can see, that has now been media blasted. That's, interestingly, this time I've decided, because the experience is showing us that surface corrosion with the dry air we're using on the blaster now, we've got a better dryer now running on that setup, that we don't get flash rusting now. As long as the unit stays dry, which it does, we don't get flash corrosion. So we're actually leaving this as bare metal. Bear in mind we re-blast the car anyway at the end of metal work. Some of the time is spent blasting off etch primer that we've put on to stop the car rusting. And it also means we have to clean the etch off wherever we're doing metal repairs. And the car does need a reasonable number of metal repairs. Onto that in a minute. But actually we decided not to etch prime, not to do our usual light coating of etch primer on this and just to leave it in bare metal just because it will make life easy. But the benefit of that is it lets you viewers see what sort of the finish is post blasting. And as you can see, Jamie will get some zoom ins on that, but it's quite a nice finish. That's the finish from the mixed grade of crushed glass that we use. We use, I think I've mentioned this before, I think what we'll do is we'll come back to the car in a minute. I'm going to go off on a blasting tangent now. I'm aware, people were asking, we'll stay here just for a minute and we'll move over to the blast room in a sec, but people were asking, they quite like the explanations I'm doing apparently on here, so I'm going to do a little bit of a background. I've actually covered blasting before on one of our autofocus series, but I think what we're going to do, we'll just do a little bit of coverage as a background to new viewers and people who haven't seen that autofocus series on what that entails. We blast vehicles with crushed glass. What I'm not going to go into is a debate about blasting versus dipping, in inverted commas. If you want to see about that, you'll have to go and watch the autofocus. I'm not going to go off on that one now. But there's a reason we do blasting. We've done it for 15 years, and we have used dipping, and we still use blasting after 15 years. So that gives you an answer as to why we do it. There's a good reason. But we blast using crushed glass, and we buy that crushed glass in from a company called Stacey Processing Limited in Wirksworth near Matlock. And we buy that, they're medium grade. I can't actually remember what the mesh size is on that, but it's quite coarse. We buy their medium grade. And what we do is we mix that. I built a screening machine in 2015 to screen out the debris and to screen out the fines from the glass post-use so that we can reuse most of the glass. And we generate some fines and some thick, big debris, but we screen all that out and we reuse the middle fraction and we then remix that with the medium grade incoming glass from Stacey Processing. And it gives a really wide cut. It basically gives you a wide range of particle sizes, and that's by far the fastest way to blast. You need the heavy particles to remove the heavy debris, and you need the fine particles to cover the area. And with the two, you cover area quickly, but it still cuts fast as well. Still carries enough weight to cut fast. But it doesn't carry so much weight that it causes excessive distortion. And you'll see on the footage of this car being blasted, me removing the paint from the quarter panels very, very carefully, a little bit at a time. You'll see on the time lapse me doing a bit and then going away and then doing a bit and moving on to a different bit. Well, that's deliberate. That wasn't accidental or me losing my concentration. That was deliberate. I think there might have been a couple of trips to the pot to do refills, but what I was doing long, careful, gentle passes, partially removing the paint, but not putting heat into the panel, because there are two reasons that distortion is caused from blasting. One is the peening effect of the grit hitting the surface of the metal, which is thousands of tiny hammers, I imagine that as. And the second one is heat, and the two combine to cause a problem. And I put my coffee, it's actually a cup of tea, I say today. It's actually a cup of tea, I'm going to admit, but it is actually a cup of tea. I just fancied a cup of tea. The two work because the heat makes the metal panel, the heat caused by the blasting makes the metal panel expand, so that puts pressure on the panel as it's trying to expand. And then the peening obviously then tries to push it inwards. So the combination of the two, the heat and the peening effect, is what causes the distortion with blasting. People say, oh, it's the heat. It's not just the heat. The heat is a contributory factor. But the heat, combined with the peening effect of the grit hitting the surface and pushing against it, are what cause the distortion. That will stretch the metal, and then it won't come back from that. And then, obviously, that creates a nightmare. So what you have to do is blast along the panel so that your grit is scratching across the surface in the same way as you would sand the panel. And at that point, you're only really putting the same pressure on the panel as you would sanding it fast. And then you have to make sure not too much heat buildup happens to counter that. And to do that, you just keep moving. Obviously, you're firing cold, compressed air across that panel at that point. It's been through a dryer, it's nice and cool. So that is going to keep the panel cool in itself. And if you keep moving, then you don't generate a heat buildup, so you don't cause that problem. So basically, shallow angle and keep moving, you don't generate distortion. And using a light media, like crushed glass, which is relatively light also, doesn't generate too much impact, doesn't put too much pressure on the panel. With all of those, you can blast a panel, such as the quarter panel on this car, where there's a reasonable amount of shape to it, without a problem. I still wouldn't try and blast something like the Audi Quattro roof, or a Mark 1 Golf bonnet, perhaps, or the middle of a Mark 1 Golf roof, in fact. I wouldn't try and blast any of them regardless with our setup. You would cause distortion on those. It's almost impossible to blast those sort of panels without causing distortion. But on something like the quarter panels on this car, not a problem at all. You'll notice I haven't done the middle of the roof. I don't think, A, I don't want to, and B, I think you probably could blast that without distorting it, but there's no corrosion on it. We'll just paint stripper that to get because it's got glue on that, and glue is quite difficult to remove. So what we'll do is we'll paint stripper the glue off that, and then we'll sand that. I don't think there's a need to blast that, so I've deliberately left that. On the subject of glue, one of the nightmares blasting this car was that we hand scraped this car to remove the underseal from it, and the hand scraping didn't remove the glue from the trim on the inside of the car. And I think I probably used over 400 kilos of abrasive or of media, removing the glue from the inside of this, and probably the other 700 kilos of media doing the whole of the rest of the car. I probably, I used a disproportionate amount of media to do the inside. But that gives you an idea that we use somewhere in the region of sort of 11 to 1200 kilos of media to blast that body shell complete. That's one of the downsides of not pyrolysing the body shell first. The upside of it is we haven't put it through an oven and we haven't caused potential issues from the oven. I don't think there would be too many, but there's a reason we've gone away from that as well. Now, is just hand scraping is the gentlest, kindest procedure to use on the car, but it does mean that the blasting is a little bit harder work. On the subject of hard work and doing my explanations and tangents, we'll wander this way over to the blast room, past the panels for Portofino, which we'll come back to in just a sec. We've had to start, we needed to do some maintenance on this. We've hit a point of urgent, critical maintenance. The deadman valve, which is hiding under here, it is in need of a rebuild. It's a periodic rebuild part. It lives a pretty hard life, and that started leaking partway through the blasting. That started leaking, which means the deadman's stopped shutting off, basically. It sticks on to an extent, and that was happening. So that valve's being rebuilt, and we also have worn out the blast hose. So again, going back to my tangent and explanation, things that people might not know. Again, I probably won't do a full spiel about every detail of blasting, but I see quite a lot of talk on the internet and possibly even on our channel, on our YouTube occasionally. People talk about blasting at home and that sort of thing. I would say in a brief summary to that, with the exception of maybe you could blast an engine bay or inside a boot aperture or something with one of those Chinese popped blasters if you could borrow a spare compressor and run 2 compressors to run it, or hire a road compressor and hire a pot, which is they're not too expensive to hire a blast setup and do it that way. But what I would say is don't fool yourself into thinking that you can just get a little compressor that will run off a plug socket in your garage and a Chinese blast pot and blast a car with it. You will not do that. You'll be there forever. give you some ideas as to the equipment we're using here. That's the nozzle we use. That's actually worn out. I need to order a new one. That's another piece that's worn out. That started as a 1/4 inch bore nozzle, and that's worn out to 8.5 mil, nearly 9 mil now. So that one's scrap. But that's tungsten carbide lined. They last us over a year actually with the amount of blasting we do. They're very long lasting, but they are quite expensive, certainly over £100 that nozzle. It's nylon sleeved tungsten carbide line nozzle, but very, very good, very, very tough, and you don't need to keep changing it. It lasts a long time. The blast hose, which I don't have, I do have the spare one actually here, because Martin's just started getting into changing this. The blast hose is a thick walled rubber pipe that goes from the pot to the nozzle and conveys the abrasive and the compressed air between the two. That's also worn out. It wears incredibly thin and gets to the point where it just kinks like that, and it's worn out, and there's a danger of it bursting. So it's a safety critical thing. At that point, that needs changing. So I've got a new blast hose to go onto it. That screws into these heavy duty couplers that couple it all together. Again, that's in the process of being rebuilt. As I say, the dead man valve there with its silencer is also being rebuilt, and I imagine that the silencer is probably going to need a rebuild as well. All the innards of the silencer will be worn away because some grit is carried through the valves on the machine by the air, and that annihilates the silencer and damages the dead man valve and things like that. So you have to keep on top of maintaining these things. While doing the blasting, I'll be using that cape and helmet, the helmet visors and the inner visors, but particularly the outer visors. Obviously, you're changing those while you're blasting because they get etched, as you can see on that one, they get etched by the media that's firing back at you. So those are a consumable part, and that needs a bit of maintenance as well in terms of changing the visors. Changing the filters on the air feed for that breathing air that's fed into that. While you're wearing that, that's fed with a positive pressure breathing air to keep the dust out of your helmet. That's fed with pressure, which we actually feed separately to our main, the blast pot. The main blasting air for this is fed by our old faithful Hydrovane diesel, 50 horsepower Hydrovane diesel compressor there, 180 cubic feet a minute compressor. The pot consumes somewhere about 120 CFM the blast pot needs. And we feed the breathing air from our workshop screw compressor because the air output from that's a lot cleaner to start with, and then we put that through a charcoal breathing air filter that feeds that, and again that's changed on a regular basis so that the breathing air is tip top that goes through that helmet. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of maintenance involved in all of this equipment, and certainly the dead man valve caught me out. I thought time flies, and I need to actually sort my maintenance spreadsheet out because I haven't got a dead man valve on that, and the dead man valve rebuilds are obviously pretty critical, and I haven't got that on the list, and that one's that's failed during blasting. But I think that's probably covered enough about blasting. I've covered the key bits on there to do with the blasting, I think, that I wanted to cover. So we'll move on to Project Portofino. As you can see, I'm sure Jamie will have got some footage of the various bits of damage on the body shell. I'm going to stand in between because I'm going to point at panels in a minute. But basically, as Jaguar XJ Coupes go, I don't think it would be possible to get anything that's much better than that one. It's an incredibly good body shell. I'm sure better ones might exist in dry states in the USA and some others that were exported elsewhere in the world. Certainly, I doubt you'd get a better one than that in the UK. It needs the outer sills replacing. You would get away with repairing the floors, but there's no point because we can buy complete floors, so we'll just change the complete floors. It needs the sill ends, it needs some repairs around the wheel arches and the inner rear wheel arches, but nothing very much on the inners, only tiny bits on the inners. The rear valance and the back of the boot floor need repairing, but the rear valance was being remodelled as part of the job on this car anyway, and so were the rear arches, so both of those areas were being addressed for aesthetic reasons in any case, so the corrosion's kind of irrelevant. The front cross member's rotten where it goes under the radiator, and then there are various localised repairs needed to the rear chassis rails around the rear subframe mounts and a few other areas, and a bit of the windscreen surround needs some repair work. but nothing really too drastic on any of that. So Matt has just set to, they're trying to be quiet at the moment because we're doing the video, but Matt's just set on with removing the lead from the various lead loaded areas on that car so that we can know that we've put good lead back in there and there's no corrosion lurking under any of the lead that's in there. So we're stripping that out first, and then the panels down here have now been picked up. Martin's just picked those up from Martin Roby's this morning. So we have the panels ready to go, and we'll be starting the job in earnest of the metalwork on that car. So from next week's video onwards, you'll be able to see that taking shape and the developments afoot on that. Alongside that, I know that Cal has spoken to Ben at Simply Performance. I think we've mentioned Simply Performance before. We've used them quite a bit. Great company to deal with. Just can't fault them. And we gave them the list of bits that we will need for that car. And they pretty much just got all of those bits available and they'll be sending them to us. So we're going for the XJR6 engine, and that's a supercharged 6. Jag AJ16, the 4-litre AJ16 with supercharger that's going in that. They have a used one of those for rebuild, so we'll be getting that. Manual gearbox, the only one to say manual, so we'll be getting a Getrag 290 transmission with the engine block adapter. Funnily enough, the car that Simply Performance are breaking for that engine and gearbox was actually a manual XJR6, which is an incredibly rare car. There can't have been more than a handful of those made, so it's quite nice that that's getting to see another life now. So yeah, the engine and gearbox are actually a pair, or a couple, from an XJR6, which is quite interesting. I'd assume that the gearbox would have just come from a 3.2 manual X300, as most of them did, but that one's actually out of a supercharged car to start with. And then it'll be having a outboard brake, late facelift XJS rear end in it. Again, Simply Performance got one on the shelf, so a used one which we'll be doing all our mock-up with, and then they will be rebuilding that as well. They'll be doing the rebuild work on that for us because we're very impressed by our sort of test ones that they've done. It'll be having the late XJS facelift ZF higher ratio steering rack, again, which we've got in stock here now, which we bought from Simply Performance previously. So that pretty much complete, and the original front cross member but with a brake upgrade, that pretty much completes all of the parts that we need to do the initial mock-up build, and which will all go into the final parts that go into the car. So all the ducks are in a row there. All of the metal, well, the bulk of the metalwork sections we need to buy in have been bought in. Most of the rest of the stuff will be done in-house and will be just repairs that we do here. So that's all pretty much all guns blazing, ready to go on that now. So yeah, the guys will be getting firing on with that into next week. And yeah, the Allegro we've covered. We've talked about where things are at on that. And then it's over to the body shop, and I'm going to peer in the booth, and at that point I'm going to hand over to Mark.
All right, welcome to this week's episode. Here she is, all done and dusted. Panels all on. It's been all wet flatted down to 1500, 2000 as you've seen last week on last week's episode. Then buffed up, then I've gone over with the fine polish on the DA mop. Got a few little fish eyes to do, which you're going to get now and then, but I'll just do little flat spots, drop the lacquer in, let that cure for a while, flat them back, polish it back up, and then done. So yeah, it's looking nice now. All the nice lines down it, all the panels. Slight little bit of adjustment on the door still, but we didn't want to get too crazy in case we scratched anything. But once we get the rubbers on, then we'll do another adjustment because you're always going to get a bit of adjusting needed. But yeah, happy with it now. A lot of effort, like say, I think it's been 5 months, but I've been on and off doing other things like strip down on the XJC, doing bits for the guys next door, like directing parts and stuff. But yeah, well happy with it. A lot of hard work, but it's paid off. So yeah, looking good. So we'll try and, me and Jamie will try and get it out later in the sun, see if we can get some more shots of it glistening away. But yeah, so we'll leave that and we'll go into the body shop now and look at the Allegro. All right, so now we're back in the body shop. We've got the Allegro in here, starting prep work, just tidying bits up to start with. They started flattening it all. We've got the new maintenance guy over here, look. Looks like Nat, look. Looks like Nat. We've had to sack the other bloke. He's not very good. No, not really. Martin's out there doing other stuff. But yeah.
Too much maintenance.
Too much maintenance. Place falling apart.
Falling apart, it's worn out.
Too much mucking about with cars. So yeah, it's only the first start of prep. I'll see over the next week. You'll see a bit more progress. Or as Nat would say, we'll have this painted next week. But no. So yeah, that's it this week. So yeah, see you next week.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Mark. And I think, with no further ado, we've pretty much summarised the fabrication shop. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Cal in the assembly shop.
Thank you very much, Nat. What I'm going to kick off with, actually, because he's mentioned Martin a few times, I probably should formally introduce Martin Savage, who has joined us this week, essentially to fill a maintenance handyman role that we've kind of had the need for since Rich left, and because he'd been filling in quite a lot of those jobs. Martin's actually the third member of staff we've now taken on from Leaping Cats, who we will have mentioned before when we took Matt on. They were a Jag XK 150, XK 120 specialist, not too far from here, and I think they closed their doors just before Christmas. So Anthony, Matt, and now Martin are all ex-Leaping Cats. I think Anthony worked with them for 10 years. I believe Matt and Martin must have worked together a lot longer than that. So yeah, good history there. And he has a rather tasty Norton motorbike that he turned up. The first time I've seen it today, he turned up in it because the sun's out, thankfully. I don't know what it is. So if you know if you're a bike spotter and you can tell me what the model and year of that Norton bike is that we've just shown, I'll give you 10 points towards nothing. Right, anyway, on that note, I'm going to move on to what we've been up to. So I've got the Camaro next to me, which has prompted me to think about what Rich has been on with this week. So I've had him pulling him off onto all sorts of different tasks. His main focal area is carrying on with the interior on this. So we've got the leather. We actually were waiting for the leather to come over from Dean, who's been finishing off some bits on Project Coupe. So he brought over the carpets, which he'd edge whipped, and the dash pad, which he'd leathered this weekend just gone, and actually dropped off the Camaro, the leftover Camaro leather. We're kind of in this transitional period at the minute of sort of moving over to doing the interior in-house. So although Dean had done the seats for this and had the leftover leather, we're kind of picking up some of the remaining work on it. So he dropped over the leather, so Richard is now able to carry on with that. He'd already patterned all the sections he's doing on the door cards. It's going to be a mix of I think it's Porsche saddle, the brown that we've got in here, and Alcantara on the door cards and rear quarter cards. So he's literally just cutting those pieces now so he can start doing all the upholstery work for that. I also had him do the headlining fit in Project Kuma. So you probably saw me jumping for joy a few weeks ago when he did the headlining in this, that I don't have to do the headlinings anymore. And I have to say, Mark 1 Escort, so one car I won't be missing doing the headlinings in, and I was sort of half braced for Richard to just do it in about 1 hour and make me look like a fool, but actually the amount of stress on his face would suggest it's not a particularly easy headlining to do. So he's been on with that. He's also done me some little A-pillar, Alcantara A-pillar covers for the Project 1 Escort, and he's just doing the sun visor upholstery for that. And then also he's been spending a bit of time with Luke. Luke will probably go into this a bit more in a minute, but been spending some time with Luke going over some of the detail of the components we're making for the interior on the Allegro projects. And this is something we should probably dwell on a little bit. Is one of the big benefits of bringing the upholstery in-house here is that now we're going to the extent of designing and creating a lot of the interior components. In fact, in some cases, all the interior components of projects we're working on. That ability for really direct communication between the guy who's going to be upholstering it and the guy who's making and designing the parts is so good, because that's really the key to everything being thought of and nothing being overlooked. And as I've said before, I'm going to put this drink down actually because I'm about to pick something up, but as I've said before, we're going to be offering upholstery as a standalone service. But once we've sort of got in the swing of this and we start expanding that service, we'll be able to offer the full process of basically designing a complete interior in a car, all the components, and doing all the upholstery. And we'll offer that as a service. So, you know, for other restorers, other resto mod companies, something it's a reasonable, I say common, it's not that common, but there are certainly companies in the States, for instance, Avant-Garde Design spring to mind as one, who do some really nice CAD design interiors, and they basically deal with the whole lot. And I want to move to the point where we can offer that service as a standalone service. So if that's something you're going to be interested in the future, just drop us an email, trim@retropower.co.uk, and we can pick up on that. I'm going to show you something which we have been doing, which links into that, which is we're finalising some of the Allegro interior design, and there's going to be an armrest on the door. That armrest is going to be essentially either a machined or 3D printed part. If it's machined, it'll be in some kind of tooling board material. And we want to be able to, it's going to have a strip running down it, which is going to be fabric, and then the actual armrest itself is going to be leather. But we want to have invisible fasteners on this. We want to have the armrest attached to the door securely enough that it's not going to get wrenched off, so it can't just be attached to the door card. It wants to actually bolt straight through into the door frame itself. So that's one of the requirements. The secondary requirement is we want it to have a bit of a soft feel to it, so it's not just hard and unpleasant feeling. And then the other considerations, because we're leathering it, we want somewhere to sit the back of the seam into, like a groove, so it doesn't bump up where the seam is. So we've been doing a trial basically to try and come up with the best way of covering all of these bases. Now, a way we have done armrests sometimes before is actually do angled bolts in from underneath. So you have a visible bolt, but because it's underneath, you don't really see it. In this instance, what we're going to do is have this armrest bolted directly into the door frame through the door card. So it not only pins the door card to the frame, but it's also, because it's bolted securely, you can lean on this. There's no risk of it breaking off. And then we wanted to have this trim strip actually go over and cover the bolts afterwards. But because we don't want this to have any visible fasteners, it needs to attach in some pretty secure way, but in a fashion that can be removed again and not have anything visible holding it. And obviously, the force, this is on the door, when you slam the door, when that door slams shut, the force trying to make this come away from the handle is quite great. So we're dwelling on possibly using magnets, and so what we've done is we've 3D printed just the very end section of the armrest, made this small section of what will be a long trim strip in mild steel, been playing with how we can glue on the back of this to stop any fraying but still leave a good metal section here which will be mild steel so it's magnetic, and then got some really strong, fairly big diameter magnets which we put in here. One of the things we've learned from this little trial is that if we leave these loose, so the bolt actually has a spacer behind it leaving these loose, they can move slightly and come out to meet up with the back of this, so they can, and they've got a bit of sideways flex in them so that they stick 100% flat onto the back of the metal. And this looks to be working very well. We also wanted to see if we could get this skived leather to conform to this amount of recess, this depth of recess. But yeah, from our tests, that snaps in extremely nicely. Is it very, very difficult to get back off there again, but is possible if you want to get to the fasteners for the armrest. Pretty happy with the groove we put in with this for the seam, but we discovered on the ends you could see the corners slightly, so we're going to make a revision on that. Again, worthwhile doing the trial. We've done, I think it's probably 5mm of foam on the top of this, and I think that's given it a pretty nice feel. We might go slightly less, and one of the things we'd noticed was because of the squashiness of the foam, you can just start seeing the line where the edge of the actual solid part is. So again, worth doing the test because we can now probably radius that slightly more, go with a slightly higher density foam. So it's these sorts of tests to prove out a concept before we execute it that are something that we're really striving to do more of. So yeah, we've learnt lessons from doing this little trial. So when we do the full size one, hopefully it'll look amazing, feel amazing, go on perfectly, that'll snap into place, it won't come off when you slam the door, all the boxes ticked. So that is that. Just going to cover a couple of things. Land Cruiser, we were just wrapping up the fuel system revisions last week, done some tests on that. We also absolutely brimmed it with fuel just to make sure that there was no leaks on any of the bolt-in sections on the fuel tanks. But that all looks to be working fine, so I'm going to be out test driving that. I think we're pretty much buttoned up all of the remaining jobs on that. So successful kind of post shakedown going over on that. I'm about to take Project 1 out for its first kind of proper road shakedown. We were just going through a couple of there was a few last little jobs on my job list for that. One was I wanted to test the low brake fluid warning light, which was a valid check to make because we were running low on inputs on the PDM, which is what activates the warning light. One way you can expand the number of inputs on a PDM if you're running an ECU that has CAN communication, it's both Motec in this case, is we can actually use inputs to the engine ECU and then communicate via CAN messaging to the PDM. So the low brake fluid warning sensor on that car is actually on input to the engine ECU, and then the engine ECU tells the PDM to put the warning light on. But there was an error in the CAN message between the two, which was meaning that wasn't working. So it was another valid check on that. So quick reprogram, that's all working fine. So on that, we've got the brake warning light flashes for low fluid and is solid with the handbrake on. And I think there was one of the last, the bumper alignment. A few of you pointed out on the video when we were taking that to detailing that the bumper was wonky on the back, which I noticed when I reviewed the video, but I couldn't really be bothered to take that shot out. So yeah, we just had to loosen the bolts and straighten it up. So there's that, putting the bonnet buffers on that as well. Just literally we're into tiny things now on it. So road testing in that next, and fingers crossed that all goes well. And actually, from thinking this is a bank holiday weekend and I won't have much to talk about, I've ended up with quite a lot because I'm now going to hand over to Luke and George to talk about what they've been up to this week.
Hi guys, welcome back to the CAD Cave and my very messy desk. It's been a busy week up here in terms of the Allegro. George, who's unfortunately not with us at the minute, has been getting on with a multitude of different things. First being the Allegro fuel cap. So we've got the arches back now, they're bonded on. Obviously he had a provision for the fuel cap in there and he's actually physically made the fuel cap now. He's also been getting on with side skirts from front lip. Now that we have the arches on the car, he's done a scan of that just to double check that everything lines up as it should, as it was in the CAD. We're now confident with that, so that's been sent off to KS and they can now get made and put on the car. That's going to look mint when it's done. I think we're reusing the original mirrors, but George has been looking at how they're going to mount on and how we're actually going to be using them and if they need to be cleaned up a little bit. Other than that, I've also been going on with Allegro stuff. My side of stuff has been predominantly to do with the interior, other than the vents which are now on the screen currently, which house this indicator unit, which I plugged in the other day and is very bright, blindingly bright, some may say. So that's now, I've literally just now got to that point where that's ready for a trial print. I gave the body shop people a little border of that so they can make sure that when they're doing all the body work on the Allegros, that all matches up perfectly. Non-exterior things are also these bonnet hinges. So Bobby did an amazing geometry for me to look at, and then I just need to replicate this into an actual part, which is now done. We're 3D printing that now, so we can mock that up and make sure that's all correct. And then in terms of interior, it's been a really productive week. We've got the rear shelf finalized, the door cards finalized, the handbrake surround, shifter surround, all of that now to a final point. Handbrake surround and shifter surround are actually being made as we speak. Door card template has been plasmid, rear shelf has been plasmid. Really, we're happy with how that's looking. I think they're going to look mint when it's done. Throughout this whole process, I've been working hand in hand with Richard, which has been such a learning experience for me because I'll send Jamie 2 renders. One which is the armrest, for example. I know Cal touched on the armrest downstairs a little bit, but the armrest, what we would have sent for before, and now what the armrest is, after we've had Richard here, who's given me a bunch of pointers. Little things like dropping this top surface down so you can add a thicker layer of foam and then leaving the edges solid so you can foam it and it becomes nice and flat. But when you put your elbow on it, it's still soft to lean on. Other things like little gaps in there for your dog ears on your leather to tuck into so you don't see any of that pressing up against it and deforming the shape. Recesses against anything that sits flush. Just all these things were in my first year of being a designer, I had no idea about. And now working with him, I've got this whole plethora of new interior design skills which I can draw upon. And I've made notes that in the future we can draw upon. So every interior now can be done to a much higher standard. So this car, I'm super excited to see how this turns out. And yeah, tune in next week to see hopefully everything sort of come together.
Thank you very much, Luke and George. And on that note, I think we're going to leave it for this week. One thing I would say though is we got out of the habit of doing questions and answers, and I was just saying, oh, is there any questions I could answer? And I realised I haven't seen many questions in the comments lately, but then we haven't been asking for them. So if there's any questions about any of the projects, anything about our business, just something you're curious about, just post it in the comments, and next week we'll see if we can answer some of those questions. And we'll see you again then.
Punch into it.